I recorded 2 videos of this project earlier. In the first one I introduced this bookcase and I made some repairs to some damage that had been suffered by some of the units. In the second video I built a new crown that is a better match to the bookcase than the one that came with it. And now it's time for me to turn my attention to restoring the finish on the original units and to matching the color of the crown to the rest of the bookcase and wrapping up all the other details to get this project out of my workshop. These units were originally finished with shellac. I learned that when I tested alcohol on some discoloration that had affected the finish on 3 of the units. The wood underneath the shellac on most of the units is birch that has been stained to give it a mahogany color. The shellac on all of the units had degraded in some way or another. It had alligatored and darkened on some of them, and it had eroded in some way on others to the point where it seemed to be nearly gone. On the sides where I wiped away the white discoloration, there was still a film of shellac, but my earlier work made it uneven and obviously disturbed. I decided my first step would be to smooth or remove the shellac from the sides of all the units and leave the stain intact. I did this to the exteriors of all the bookcase units, as well as the frames of the bookcase doors. With the original shellac smoothed or removed, I could then rebuild the finish with fresh shellac. It took only a few minutes per side with some alcohol to reveal what the bookcase units looked like when they were new. On the left here is the old finish, and on the right side most of the old shellac has been removed. This unit had the darkest and one of the worst looking surfaces of the set, and until I cleaned it up I didn't realize that this unit actually is mahogany rather than birch with a mahogany stain. Even though it shows up well on video with a bright light nearby, the old finish was so dark and degraded that the wood underneath wasn't distinguishable. The base took some additional work. There was a thick film of something on the legs that didn't come away with alcohol. I'm guessing it was decades of floor wax. Since it just laughed at alcohol, I used a scraper instead until I got through the built-up residue. Having smoothed out or removed the old finish, I could look over the colors of the pieces underneath. There was a lot of variation in color between these units and even between different parts of the same one. Having discovered that one of the bookcase units has real mahogany sides, and knowing already that another unit has walnut sides, that makes 3 distinct species of wood on the exterior of the bookcase. I knew from the outset that this bookcase probably started out as parts of at least 4 different bookcases that ended up together for much of its lifetime. Before I began reapplying finish to the bookcase units, I wanted to dye the crown in order to have its base color match some of the original units. That way, my work to reapply the shellac finish could start with all the pieces at the same point. Applying dye is not something that I have a lot of experience with, so I took a lot of time experimenting and made a lot of samples. I mixed up some basic dye recipes using water and dye concentrate. For these dyes I needed a mere teaspoon of concentrate for about 6 ounces of distilled water or alcohol. I started and ended my experiments with water as the carrier for the dye. Once I found a combination of dye concentrates that would give me my target color, I got the crown ready to go. Since the dye is mixed with water, and water tends to raise the grain of bare wood, I first had to wet the entire piece with water, let it dry thoroughly, and then sand back the raised fibers with fine paper. I vacuumed the sanding dust and wiped the piece down. Then I did it a second time, which wasn't absolutely necessary, but I wasn't on a deadline, and it did help a little bit. After the crown dried the second time, I put it in the crosshairs of my sprayer. With a sprayer, it's much easier to get the color on evenly as opposed to using a rag or a brush. Three applications gave me the color I was looking for. I also applied some initial thin coats of shellac to get the crown to about the same point as the rest of the bookcase, and at that point I attached the piece of back trim that I had made before but left loose. The rough finish you may notice on the surface is the result of my still learning how to spray well. I did also have some more small repairs to make to a couple of the bookcase units, chipped areas that I kept forgetting about in my rush to get dye applied to the crown. I considered using wood filler for these chipped areas, and one of my experiments earlier had been to test a manufacturer's promise that its wood filler could take dye or stain just like solid wood. Are you convinced? Me either. Using filler wouldn't be a purist approach to making these repairs anyhow. I decided I would instead do some careful surgery and attach slivers of real wood to these areas and shape them to match. I broke out the hide glue again so these repairs, which will be noticeable at close distances, can be undone if that's ever needed. I used the sprayer to apply coats of shellac to the units. The first coat or two were natural shellac, and after that I applied toner coats with either red mahogany or brown mahogany dye to match the colors of the units. I had thought at first that I would just live with the color variation between all of the units, but later I decided the pieces needed to be closer in color to one another. Except for the case that's made of walnut. I decided to leave that one as it is, and when I put these bookcases to use, I'll use that one separately somehow. All of the doors got the same attention as the bookcase exteriors. The old damaged finish was removed, and the new finish that went on was matched with the cases. The finish on the insides of the bookcases was in much better condition, aside from some signs of use. Each unit also had the original manufacturer's decal in varying degrees of completeness, and I didn't want to disturb them. So I addressed the insides of the units much less aggressively than the outsides, simply touching up the wear spots by patting on a thin layer of fresh shellac. After the finishing was done, it was time to replace the glass in the doors. First, each piece of glass got a thorough cleaning, and then it was reinserted into its respective door. Since I saved all of the molding used to hold the glass in the doors, it was simply an exercise in matching up each piece to its place in the frame. I used the original nails and the original holes. Not long ago, I tried to call this project done for the time being, knowing that I had a walnut base with mahogany colored bookcase units stacked on top of it, and I thought I could live with that for a while. Well, that lasted about 12 hours, and at my next opportunity I was picking out material that I could use to build a new base that I could color to match the mahogany units. The walnut base and the one walnut bookcase unit that I have I'm going to use separately, but all the mahogany or mahogany colored units I'm going to use together as one set. In my first installment, when I introduced these bookcase units, I mentioned that I had inquired with the manufacturer to see if they could tell me the age of these bookcase units. They were busy at the time and they couldn't get back to me. I inquired again not long ago, and I got an answer back. These original bookcase units were made in the 1940s and 1950s, which squares well with Dr. Gamow's time at George Washington University. He was there from 1934 to 1954. So, 2 years and a few months after I dragged these bookcase units home, I finally got them restored, and I'm looking forward to putting them to use. I hope you got something out of seeing the process. Thank you for watching.